This is coconut oil fake news part 2, when the food and medical empire strike back against those who have written articles or have done videos that criticize the recent fake news promoted by the media and the American Heart Association regarding coconut oil. So this came out on Medscape June 30th, about 15 days after the fake coconut oil news first broke. And you can see the title, Correcting the Saturated Fat Myth. And if you want, you can Google this and listen to it. It's only about a minute. They refer to this as our 1-minute news story for primary care. And the purpose of this is to reinforce the harms of saturated fats. This is just a terrible terminology that they're using. Look what we are told. Media reports about saturated fats like butter and red meat can be confusing. No kidding. And it's confusing when it comes from scientists also. So most Americans, in fact, believe that coconut oil, another saturated fat, is good for them. So look, we're told here, butter, red meat, and coconut oil are all saturated fat. Okay? Saturated fats like butter and red meat. Now this is ridiculous. So we have to go to nutritiondata.com. We're going to pull up ribeye, and we're going to look at, so you can see, ribeye, there you go, for all you steak lovers. So we go down to the calorie information. Look at the calorie sources in ribeye, steak, and all other meats. So fat, 357 calories, and protein, 268 calories. But this means it's insane to call meat a saturated fat. You get almost half your calories, depending upon leanness, from protein. So now we go down to fats and fatty acids, and we look at the fat content. Here's saturated, here's mono, and here's poly. So do you see how disingenuous it is to say that meat is a saturated fat? It's half protein, and then the fat content itself, 15.4 grams saturated, 16.2 grams monounsaturated. These monounsaturated fatty acids are the same monos that you will find in olive oil. There is no difference. It's typically oleic acid, 18-carbon oleic acid. But there's more, slightly more, monounsaturated than saturated. So how is it even remotely reasonable to suggest that meat, which contains half protein and more monounsaturated fat than saturated fatty acids, is somehow a saturated fat? It's ridiculous. Let's look at butter. We're also told another saturated fat. So here's butter. Go down to fatty acid content. So saturated fatty acid, they should say fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids, mono, and polys. Okay, so here's saturated, 7.2. Here is mono, just about 3. So how can you call butter a saturated fat when almost 1/3 of it in this chart is not, actually more because you got the polys and the monos, is not saturated fat? Totally disingenuous. You can see how absolutely inaccurate this messaging is. So with messaging this inaccurate, you have to think about how poorly delivered their information about LDL cholesterol is when it comes to body health, and I'll show you that in a couple seconds as well. Let's go to coconut oil, because remember, coconut oil, saturated fat. Well, first of all, it's an oil. Fat is different than an oil, although coconut oil tends to be more solid at room temperature than, say, olive. But the classic definition of an oil is one that is liquid at room temperature, and a fat is solid at room temperature. So we go down coconut oil, and we see saturated fatty acids, 11.7, mono 0.8, poly 0.1. So about 11 times more saturated fatty acids than mono or polys, but it has mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. There is no pure source in our food supply of just saturated fatty acids. So this terminology is completely inaccurate. And the saturated fatty acids in coconut oil are anti-inflammatory, particularly lauric acid. So we'll talk about the LDL thing in a couple seconds. Let's go to vegetable oil. They said, you should be going for canola oil, because canola oil, we're told, is a mono or a poly. Well, look at this. Canola oil also has saturated fatty acids, as does olive oil. So it's ridiculous to use terms words like this. Saturated fats like butter, red meat, and coconut oil is us poor, silly Americans somehow think that this stuff is good for us. Now remember, if you just ate 5,000 calories of coconut oil, you'd be sick. So we're talking about a little bit here and there. So what? So the silly view that all us little people have about coconut oil prompted the American Heart Association to issue an advisory warning about the harmful effects of saturated fats. The AHA, so American Heart Association, emphasizes that well-controlled studies show overwhelmingly that saturated fats raise LDL and increase risk of heart disease. Well, let's see. If you're living on 4,000 calories per day, you're eating tons of sugar and flour, and you throw a bunch of butter on there, why are we going to just blame the butter? I mean, obviously, butter calories on top of sugar and flour calories are problematic. So we're told, right? We're told to eat, to avoid less saturated fat and instead use poly or monos, such as canola oil, soybean, or olive oil. Well, first of all, you saw before that canola contains saturated fatty acids. I didn't show you soy or olive oil, but they do as well. And they say substitute saturated fat with whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. This is ridiculous. We don't, I mean, so you're going to just compare. So here, would you like, imagine being a parent, a mother, feeding your child a breakfast. Would you like would you like eggs with vegetables? Would you like fruit with yogurt? Or would you like a bowl of coconut oil? I mean, this is insane to even use this terminology. But their big emphasis is always on saturated fats raise LDL cholesterol. And certain ones do. That is true. We'll talk about that in a couple seconds. But what they fail to emphasize here about with LDL cholesterol is the real issue. And you can see this comes from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. The problem is the modification, the oxidation of LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol becomes oxidized, which means free radicalized, and this free radicalization is correlated to abdominal obesity. And elevating, you can see right here, another marker. So looking at C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker. Another marker that's popular among practitioners is small, dense LDL, which is more susceptible to free radicalization than large, buoyant LDL. How do you know if you have small or dense or large buoyant? You can do a test called the VAP test, a comparison. You can Google VAP test, VAP cholesterol test. But when we're looking at small, dense LDL, how would we be able to get an idea? Well, it turns out that small, dense, oxidized LDL appears to be proportional to the degree of hypertriglyceridemia. So normal triglycerides should be fasting below 90 and to not have metabolic syndrome to be below 150. That's how you get an idea if your LDL is flaming or not just saturated fat elevates LDL and you should run it, and you should not eat bowls of coconut oil and have fruit instead or something else. Okay, going further onward to another paper that discusses your LDL scenario. This comes from the Journal of Internal Medicine. Circulating oxidized LDL is associated with risk factors of the metabolic syndrome and LDL size in clinically healthy, almost 60-year-old men. So we look at LDL in the greater context, not in this myopic, this absolutely ridiculous myopic view that you eat coconut oil, LDL goes up, and then you're going to die of heart disease, which is what the AHA wants to emphasize. And then, so what should we do? Well, we get freaked out and go back into eating simple suppers, which is cookies, bread, and milk, as described in my earlier food propaganda videos. So how can we get a proper view of saturated fatty acids? Well, one way is to look at this paper here. You can see saturated fats, what dietary intake. This comes from the National Library of Medicine's PubMed source. We can click right to it. This is the article, saturated fats, what dietary intake. So this paper is all about saturated fatty acids, and it turns out that saturated fatty, certain ones, not all, certain ones, myristic acid would be the biggest. Certain ones elevate LDL cholesterol, but they also elevate HDL cholesterol. So what is the traditional cardiovascular risk factor concern that people have? Their LDL is up, their HDL is down. That's impossible to do from eating butter, because butter contains no carbohydrate. It's not going to promote metabolic syndrome. It contains saturated fatty acids. Well, in excess it could, but saturated fatty acids that do what? Elevate LDL and lower HDL cholesterol. Saturated fatty acids cannot lower HDL cholesterol. And so, because people suffer from elevated L, lower HDL, you know it's not a saturated fatty acid issue. It is a metabolic syndrome, obesity issue, and all this is covered in substantial detail in several chapters in the Deflame Diet book, which is worth the read. You'll get more information about the fatty acid misunderstanding and misinformation in these 3 chapters, and then the related references there that you'll get from the propaganda center that myopically looks at meat as a saturated fat. How ridiculous. We need to avoid the fake news from the food, medical, industrial, pharmaceutical, industrial complexes that really appear not to have our best interests at heart.